Hello everyone, can you hear me okay? Brilliant. Welcome to Unit 1.3 of this year's Tree Leaf Rohatsu retreat. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. I think there's 30 people, which is really wonderful. It's so lovely. It's such a brilliant time of year at the end of Ango to all come together and celebrate the Buddha's awakening and seeing the morning star on the morning of his awakening, which is what the Rohatsu retreat's all about. So, for Unit 3 on day 1, what we have for you planned is some Zazen, some Kinhin, then Zazen and a Dharma talk, more Kinhin, and in case you missed it, some more Zazen. And we're going to be running for about 2 hours 15 minutes. In the Kinhin after the first Zazen, I'll probably suggest, and I'll say it again at the time, to get a hot drink or something. My Dharma talk's going to be about 30 minutes, so get yourself a drink and a comfortable cushion and we'll all be good. Okay, so we'll begin with 40 minutes of Zazen. So if you want to take your positions. Kinhin. As I said at the beginning, after this Kinhin there'll be a Dharma talk, so feel absolutely free to get yourself a hot drink. And for the Dharma talk you can either sit Zazen or just sit normally with a drink and just listen, so feel free. But yeah, there'll be 10 minutes of Kinhin now. There will now be a talk, so either you're welcome to sit in Zazen or just sit comfortably. I think if you get to the end of Rohatsu and you haven't had too much Zazen, I'll be surprised. So it's okay just to have one session where you just sit. I'd like to ask my friend Kyonin to do the verse of opening the sutra, and it's lovely to have you with us, Kyonin at Rohatsu. So yeah, thanks for being here with us.
The Dharma, incomparably profound and infinitely subtle, is always encountered yet rarely perceived. Now we see, hear, receive, and maintain this. May we all realize the Tathagata's true meaning. The Dharma, incomparably profound and infinitely subtle, is always encountered yet rarely perceived. Now we see, hear, receive, and maintain this. May we all realize the Tathagata's true meaning. The Dharma, incomparably profound and infinitely subtle, is always encountered yet rarely perceived. Now we see, hear, receive, and maintain this. May we all realize the Tathagata's true meaning.
Thank you very much, Kyonin. As you know, if you've been to one of our Rohatsu sessions before, Jundo gives us a text to work with, and all of the people giving talks, all of the priests and priests in training giving talks, all talk on the same text, and we all get kind of sequential parts of the text to talk to you about. And the text we have this year is called Jijuyu Zanmai, Jijuyu Zanmai by Menzan Zuiho. And Jijuyu Zanmai roughly translates as self-fulfilling samadhi. And hopefully by the end of the talk, I will give you some idea of who Menzan was and his significance in Soto Zen, what Jijuyu Zanmai is, and because this is a talk on Soto Zen, you can probably guess that I'm going to talk about Zazen a little as well. There's always a chance. Just before this retreat, Shoka wrote to me and said, what are you going to be talking about in your talk? And I said, Zazen. And she was like, yeah, it's what we talk about. So, since I'm the first one to give a talk on this text, I just want to give you a little background on Menzan. And Menzan, somebody in Soto Zen, we don't talk about that often, but probably should. He's not as well known as Dogen or Keizan, or even going back to the Caodong line of Dongshan and other Chinese teachers. I was listening to a talk the other night by Kathy Fisher from Everyday Zen, and she said, whereas we often think that we're practicing a form of medieval Zen, that's not totally true, because both Soto Zen and Rinzai Zen were massively reformed in the Tokugawa era. That's also known as the Edo period, and it was between 1603 and 1867. So it's comparatively recent compared to Dogen, who was around in the 13th century. And in the Rinzai tradition, the main reformer was Hakuin, and probably most people have heard of Hakuin, even though he's not in our tradition. And he came up with the koan curriculum that is still used in Rinzai schools. And he transformed the tradition and made it what it is today, go from what had been brought from Linji or Rinzai's time. He kind of codified it as it is now. And Menzan did the same for Soto Zen. And Menzan, he was born in 1683 and died in 1769, so most of his work was done in the 18th century. And although it sounds strange to us now, at that time, people didn't really study Dogen. Dogen was kind of pretty much lost in the Soto tradition. There may have been, people in certain monasteries who studied him, but it wasn't the kind of thing, whereas we all know about Dogen, and probably we've all read some Dogen at least. That was not true then. So Menzan went back to Dogen, he brought the teachings back into use in the Soto tradition, and he also used Dogen's monastic code to rewrite the Soto Zen monastic code. So actually, the Soto Zen we practice today and the Soto Zen they practice today in Japan is very much a result of Menzan's work. And like Dogen, he was a prolific writer. He wrote a lot. And the Jijuyu Zanmai is just one of the texts we have left to us by Menzan. So, beginning at the beginning of this, and reading from Menzan's words. The teachings of the Tathagata. I imagine most people have come across the word Tathagata. It means thus gone one, and it's an epithet for the historical Buddha. The teachings of the Tathagata, found in the various sutras, have been classified as sudden and gradual, provisional and direct. These teachings contain various types of preaching since they were given according to the qualities of the people the Buddha taught. The true enlightenment of the Tathagata is not manifested directly in these sutras, since they are provisional teachings. Although the Buddha expressed his true mind in some Mahayana sutras, in many cases the true teachings are no longer true, because the commentators of those sutras and commentaries interpreted them with their ordinary discriminating minds and intellectual understanding. That is why it is said in the Flower Ornament Sutra that interpretation through words stands against the Buddhas in the past, present and future. Also in the Lankavatara Sutra, it is said that the Buddha did not speak even one word during the 49 years he taught. From this, it should be clear that the true enlightenment of the Tathagata can never be grasped by words or by discrimination, nor by the illusory mind of ordinary human beings. Now, if you've read Zen for a bit, if you've read Alan Watts, and you've read various Zen texts, this probably sounds familiar. It's kind of Zen cannot be understood with words and letters. If you speak of Zen, you kind of miss it. To talk about practice through words is to kind of grasp at something that's ineffable. And this goes back to something that's attributed to Bodhidharma, although it actually probably came from China around the 12th century. And you've probably heard this or parts of it, that Zen was described as a special transmission outside the scriptures, not founded upon words and letters. By pointing directly to one's mind, it lets one see into one's true nature, and thus attain Buddhahood. When I first read or heard that, as I imagine like a lot of you, I was thinking, okay, this is fine. Outside of words and letters, why have I got a library of Zen books? Why has Dogen written 95 fascicles on Shobogenzo? And it doesn't mean, though some people interpret it, doesn't mean don't read stuff, don't read Zen books. Zen books are great. Well, some of them are. Dogen, as I say, Dogen wrote a lot. Menzan wrote a lot. Jundo has apparently written a book I think he'd quite like us to read. And the fact is, these books are really helpful. I find them really helpful in pointing me in the right direction of practice. But what, as I imagine you know, this is saying is it's not enough to read. It's like if you've got tea now or coffee, it's like the difference between reading a book on what coffee or tea tastes like and actually tasting it for yourself. So in the books on Zen, even the Buddha's own words, as much as we have them in the Pali Canon, Dogen's writings, Keizen's writing, modern teachers' writings, it writes of Shunryu Suzuki, Jundo, Norman Fisher, whoever. They're great, and I commend you to read as much Zen as you find helpful. But at the end of the day, when we've read all that, we have to sit on the cushion and experience how it is to practice. Without that practice, we can't taste the tea. As I say, the reading's great, but the cushion and through our off the cushion life, that's where we become intimate with life. That's where we actually experience what it is to live, what it is to actually rest in the experience of life. So this is why we sit, this is why we practice, and this is why, although we study Dogen and we study other texts and we listen to Dharma talks like this one, our central practice is to get ourselves to the cushion. So, the next part of the text. When the Buddha was on Mount Ryoju, which is Vulture Peak, with his 1 million students, he picked up a flower and blinked, and the Venerable Mahakasyapa smiled. At that time the Tathagata said to the assembly, I transmit the Shobo Genzo, Nehan Myoshin, the storehouse of the true Dharma I, to Mahakasyapa. This Nehan Myoshin is the Tathagata's true enlightenment, which precedes language, discrimination, and illusory mind. This is also called the Jijuyu Zanmai, which has been transmitted for 51 generations, from the Buddha to Bodhidharma in India, down through the 6th patriarch, Huineng in China, and to Eihei Dogen in Japan. The simultaneous practice enlightenment of this samadhi is nothing other than Keka Fusa, or the full lotus sitting, which we practice today. Again, I imagine that those of you who've read much about Zen knows this story, or you've heard somebody talk about it. It's a kind of foundation myth of Zen. The Buddha holding up the flower and Mahakasyapa smiling. And it doesn't say what everyone else is doing, but what I imagine everyone else was doing was immediately going into kind of discursive, discriminating thought, thinking, why is the Buddha holding up a flower? Is this symbolic of something? Am I supposed to grasp this meaning? Does it symbolize enlightenment, spring, spiritual growth? What kind of flower is it? They're just kind of lost in these thoughts. Whereas Mahakasyapa, I think, he just saw the flower. He received the experience of the flower and how beautiful it was, and then he smiled. So whereas everyone else was just kind of trapped in a mental bubble of their experience, Mahakasyapa was just instead having a direct experience. And I think we can relate this to Zazen, in that when we sit on the cushion, that's what we're doing. We're just becoming intimate with our experience. We're trying to drop away some of that judging, some of that conceptualizing, some of that thinking, trying to understand, trying to work things out, and just saying, okay, just for the next 30 minutes, I'm just going to sit with my experience and see what it is, what this is. Mahakasyapa was an interesting figure as well. He wasn't the foremost disciple of Buddha, but by the time of the Buddha's death, his two foremost disciples, Shariputra and Maudgalyana, had already passed. So Mahakasyapa was the one who took the role in the Buddha's cremation, and he also presided over what's known as the First Council. We don't know if this is historically accurate, but it's said that after the Buddha's death, all of the Sangha, all of the monks and nuns and lay people got together, or mainly probably the monastics got together and recollected what the Buddha had taught, and also they worked out his monastic discipline as well, the Vinaya. And it said that that first meeting was a way of trying to codify some of the Buddha's teachings at that time. So Mahakasyapa was seen as the first descendant of the Buddha. And then also this idea of transmitting the true Dharma eye, the true way of being able to see and relate to our experience, started there. That it wasn't because of something the Buddha said that Mahakasyapa was awakened. It was just through holding up this flower. So, what is Jiju Zanmai, or self-fulfilling samadhi? Well, I think it's just Zazen. It's just that resting in the experience of what is, receiving those sense impressions and trying not to add our conceptions on top of them. What we often do in life is we make stories about what's happening to us. We make a narrative about what's going on. We bring our preferences of I like that, I don't like that, this is good, this is bad. And in Jiju Zanmai, we let that drop. What we're doing is just being intimate with all of life as it is at this very moment. When we could go further and use kind of mystical words like we're dwelling in unborn mirror-like awareness, and some people might like that, other people it sounds too zen-y. But this is what we're passing from generation of Zen students to generation of Zen students. This practice of just being with what is. And we all sit, and you'll know it's harder than it sounds. Because our human brains are built to try and work things out. They're built to understand, they're built to discriminate. And there's nothing wrong with that. That comes in very handy. If you hear a rustle, if you're like in a forest and you hear a rustle, it's useful to be able to discriminate if that's another rambler or if it's a bear. Our minds are handy. They come in useful for a lot of things. And it's not like we have to dwell in self-fulfilling samadhi the whole time. But the fact is, this practice allows us to go beyond that small self of discriminating and be fully intimate with experience. And when we're fully intimate, the self kind of drops away and we can just see things for how they are. So, the next part. Tentatively, this samadhi, i.e. Jiju Zanmai, is called Zazen. The reason it is referred to as Zazen is as follows. Bodhidharma came from India to China and sat facing the wall at Shorin Temple. At that time, people who did not understand that what he was practicing was Jujuyu Zanmai, because the posture of his practice was similar to that of the dhyana of the 4 stages and samadhi of the 8 stages described by the Buddhist scholars of the time. That is why his practice was commonly called Zazen, which translates as seated dhyana or seated samadhi. Consequently, his successors were called followers of the Zen or dhyana school. However, originally, Shobogenzo Nihan Myoshin, which has been directly transmitted through the Buddhas and ancestors, was not necessarily called seated dhyana. So, what Menzan's doing here is making a difference between the practices of other Buddhist schools, which you may have done some of them, which involve concentration meditation or insight meditation, and the meditation is a means to an end. You sit focusing on your breath so you can develop concentration, or you sit focusing on the flow of thoughts and sensations to understand impermanence and how awareness works. And this is where Zazen is different, and why Jujuyu Zanmai is called self-fulfilling samadhi. It's not called self-fulfilling samadhi because it fulfills the self, but it's self-fulfilling in that the practice is the goal. We don't practice Zazen to achieve something. When we sit and are intimate with everything we're experiencing, that's not just the practice, that's the goal. So that self-fulfilling samadhi, that kind of unborn awareness that's always there whenever we sit, and we just let ourselves rest in that experience. We let go of some of that discriminating mind and ego that wants excitement, doesn't want to be bored, it doesn't want to be sitting, it wants to be doing something else. And when we drop that, we find there's just a place where we can just experience what is. And as I say, that's both the practice and the goal. And Jujuyu Zanmai is actually a name which is also given to part of Dogen's Bendowa fascicle in Shobogenzo. And it's normally the first, chronologically it's the first fascicle, and often numerically it's the first fascicle of Shobogenzo. And whereas Fukan Zanzengi, the universally recommended instructions for Zazen, was some short instructions on Zazen that Dogen wrote on returning from China. It's quite short, it's a couple of pages, really good instructions for Zazen, but very simple. Bendowa is more like a companion piece where he describes a greater depth of why we practice shikantaza. And if you're going to read any Dogen, I'd recommend those 2 pieces as a starting point, Fukan Zazengi and Bendowa. And in Fukan Zazengi, Dogen says, sitting in Zazen is not learning Zen concentration. It is simply the peaceful and joyful gate of the Dharma. It is the practice and experience which perfectly realizes the state of Bodhi. The right Dharma is naturally manifesting itself before us. And that's going back to what I was saying before about what Menzan was saying. It's just the Zazen is the essence of our practice. We're not practicing concentration to get better at concentration. We're not practicing insight meditation. We're just manifesting Buddhahood right here, right now, on the cushion, with everything that is. And that probably sounds too good to be true. I'm sure we've all sat in Zazen with aching backs, with something going on outside, somebody's car alarm going off, or some people shouting at each other, and going, yeah, right, so this is like Buddha manifest on the cushion. And yes, it is. The only difference is having preferences or not. When we sit, we're just there to experience what is. And what is isn't necessarily what we want to experience. In Qin Ming, Faith in Mind, it said, the great way is easy. Just give up your preferences. That's hard. And in actuality, we don't really need to do it because we have to have preferences in life. And that's fine. It's fine to have preferences, but it's also good to be aware of when we're having preferences. When we're on the cushion, though, and we can take this into life, whatever's happening is okay. We don't need to fix it. If there's car alarms going off, we don't need to fix it. I mean, possibly if it's our car and somebody's trying to break into it, maybe we do need to look at that. But mostly, if it's just experience, we don't need to fix it. The second noble truth the Buddha talked about basically says, if we grasp onto an idea of how we want things to be, we're going to suffer. And on the cushion, we can let go of how we want things to be and actually let things come to us on their own terms. We're not telling life how it needs to be. We're seeing how life is. Most of you probably know I have a chronic illness. And as chronic illnesses do, sometimes it's a bit better, sometimes it's a bit worse. If I have a particularly bad patch, for the first few hours of that, maybe the first day, I rail against the world, saying, it shouldn't be like this. This isn't how it's supposed to be. But why isn't it? As I say, chronic illnesses get better and worse. So after a short time, I just relax into it. Just rest, and then I can do what I need to do. Go to bed, maybe take some pain medication, whatever. But I'm not telling life how it needs to be. Does it still suck? Probably still sucks, but it sucks less than if I'm trying to dictate to life how it is. And that's what we're doing in Juju Zanmai, in Shikantaza, in Zazen. We're just letting life be as it is. We're setting aside our preferences and our likes and our dislikes. In Benduar, Dogen says, if a human being, even for a single moment, manifests the Buddha's posture in the three forms of conduct, while that person sits up straight in samadhi, the entire world of Dharma assumes the Buddha's posture, and the whole of space becomes a state of realization. Again, that kind of sounds too good to be true. It's like I'm sitting on my cushion and everything is realized. But if we just let things be as they are, including how we are, everything is just manifesting its own Buddha nature. Everything is in its right Dharma position. And what Dogen said is true. The whole of space becomes a state of realization. It probably rarely feels like that to us. And the reason for that is we've still got ideas about how things should be. If we sit on the cushion and we have a sit where everything seems to flow and be really peaceful and our awareness is spacious and space-like, that feels like a good sit. Whereas if we have a sit where we're just begging the bell to come and thinking, I'm sure somebody's forgotten to ring the bell, we've been here an hour, then we think that's a bad sit. But you don't need to fix either of those things. They're both perfectly fine. So you'll probably be glad to know we're coming to the last part of Menzan's words. The Buddha's awareness, called Nehan Myoshin, is perfect and always quietly illuminating itself. This is the be-all of the Buddhas and the end-all of the ancestors. Understand this clearly and believe that this Jijuyu Zanmai is Shinjin Datsuraku, Datsuraku Shinjin, those translators, dropping off body and mind dropped off. All of these terms are taken from the various teachings of the Buddhas and patriarchs, are names for the Zazen we practice. You may have heard the dropping off body and mind before. When Dogen travelled to China, he wrote the Hokkyoki about it. And it talks about when he realized his true nature with his teacher Rujing. He went to his teacher's room and lit incense. And when Rujin came into the room, Dogen said, Shinjin Datsuraku, or dropped away body and mind, meaning he had realized that awareness that was free of notions of self. And Rujing replied, Datsuraku Shinjin, body and mind dropped away, confirming it. In one of the most well-known parts of Genjo Koan, another fascicle of Shobogenzo, Dogen says, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by a myriad things. When actualized by myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So what's he talking about? Well, when we do sit in Zazen and we look at what we think is the self, we notice that there's nothing fixed there. So it's not to study the self is to forget the self. It's more to study the self, we kind of recognize the lack of concrete self. Although also by being intimate with all things, the kind of notion of self drops away, because our notion of self is just another aspect of experience. It's nothing special. It's something we create. It's something useful, something provisional and relative, but it's still something we create. Jundo, who should probably get a mention by now, often talks about an instruction in Shikantaza that's missing from most people's teachings on it, is trust. We often use our discriminating mind to work things out, to keep us safe. And what we're doing in Shikantaza is developing trust in our innate ability to be intimate with life and just let things be as they are. We don't have to always be meddling with the world. We don't always have to be fixing things. We don't always have to be getting life to conform to our idea of it. We can trust that most things are okay without our meddling. And in fact, as most of us probably know, sometimes life is a lot better, or not a lot better, but life gets on perfectly well without our meddling, and our meddling can kind of mess things up a bit. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do things when we feel we should step in, but often, more often than we probably think, we can just trust things to take care of themselves. And what I find when I'm on the cushion, the more I let go, the more I trust. And again, this is going to sound kind of zen-y. It sort of feels like life is illuminating me, and that self-fulfilling samadhi is working through me. It's not something I have to do. It's something that happens in and of itself. And in Genjo Koan, Dogen says, driving ourselves to practice and experience millions of things and phenomena is delusion. But when millions of things and phenomena actively practice and experience ourselves, that's realization. That was the Nishijima cross-translation. Tanahashi puts it maybe a bit clearer. To carry the self forward and illuminate myriad things is delusion. That myriad things come forth and illuminate the self is awakening. So basically, if we with our small self try to dictate to life and discriminate what's good and what's bad, that's delusion. But just allowing life to be as it is, to trust, that's awakening. Just letting things flow through us. letting the right action arise by itself. This is a true intimacy with life, and for me that's what Zen's about. It's about being intimate with our experience, not missing out on life by being trapped in the stories of what's going on. And I think about being in a romantic relationship, that often we get lost in ideas of how our partner should be, or ideas of how they are based on what they've done in the past. And that's not true intimacy. True intimacy should be relating to a person or things just as they are, fresh in each moment. And this, of course, is what Zazen is. It's not experiencing things as they were, as they might be, or as we think they are. It's about fresh in every moment, experiencing it new. Letting go what's past, letting go what's to come, even letting go of ideas of now, and just resting in what is. In Fuken Zazengi, Dogen concludes by saying, if you practice the state like this for a long time, you will surely become the state like this itself. The treasure house will open naturally, and you will be free to receive and to use its contents as you like. So what is this treasure house? It may not surprise you to learn it's Jujuyu Samadhi. It's the knowledge we're not limited by the ideas of our small selves and our likes and dislikes, but instead we can go beyond that and experience life based on intimacy and trust, and the knowledge that who we really are is far bigger than that. It's being part of the wholeness of everything that is. We can trust the Buddha sees through our eyes and Kannon uses our hands. And being intimate with life, it doesn't have to happen all at once. But each time we're on the cushion and each day we can maybe let go of ourself and our discriminating mind a little more and let our Buddha nature just shine through a little more. And doing that starts on the cushion. So thank you very much for listening. I know I bang on a bit and I like words, and yet that's a fault. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to ask, but don't make them too hard. Kyonin.
Thank you for your wonderful talk, Goku. It was very, very beautiful. Just one comment. It's not a question, so I am not going to put you in trouble. Just to say that very often we separate our Zen practice and our real life. So we have our work, our family issues, our school things, and then we go to Zazenkai in the weekend. But we separate our spiritual life from real life, and that's a big mistake because samadhi will never fulfill itself by doing this. With your talk, we need to understand that everything that we live, everything that we go through is our practice. Everything is Zen. Our life is our temple. So in order to live the fulfillment of our practice, we need to understand that Zazen is not just our time in the cushion. It extrapolates to every single corner of our experience. And I really loved how you mentioned that by sitting Zazen, we get intimate with life. But at the same time, with practice and with time, in time, we sit Zazen every single second of the day. And in this way, we start to let go of things and just to be present in the moment. So let's not separate.
That's lovely. Thank you, Kyonin. I agree completely. It kind of starts on the cushion where it's easier But then, yeah, just practice is our entire life. I couldn't say it better. Perfect. Well, I'm not sure what time we start the next thing. Is it?
We have 4 to 5 minutes.
We've got. Well, we should be doing Kinhin now. So, thank you really very much for listening to my talk. I really appreciate it, and I promise I will try and make them shorter in future. So, we shall now have 10 minutes of Kinhin. Zazen. Thank you so much for joining me for this unit. I believe we now have a rest for 25 minutes and then reconvene for unit 1.4, which I think is going to be Samu, led by Jinkan. So thanks very much and see you soon.